Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. Today, we are launching our Election 2024 series. If the past 35 days are any indication, it's clear it would be imprudent to straight line expectations, certainly about the next 98 days. Following the debate and its aftermath, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, naming J.D. Vance to the GOP ticket, the Republican National Convention, the decision by President Biden to drop his bid for re-election, and the enthusiastic embrace of Vice President Kamala Harris as the presumptive Democratic nominee, I think we'd all agree it's been an exceptionally dynamic month, making it ever more challenging to separate signal from noise. So to help us make sense of all this, I'm joined today by two guests. John Anzalone is the founding partner of Impact Research. He served as the chief pollster for President Biden's 2020 campaign. He also polled for the Obama 2008 and 2012 campaigns, Hillary Clinton in 2016, and numerous House, Senate, and gubernatorial campaigns. He also works with Fortune 500 companies on messaging, branding, and data-driven corporate strategy, specializing in navigating the political environment with its attendant cultural dynamics and perpetual crisis. Also, my longtime colleague, Nate Tamarin, is with me today. Nate's a senior managing director. Previously, he served in the Obama administration as special assistant to the president for public engagement and associate director of the White House Office of Public Affairs. So I'm pleased to have both John and Nate join Teneo Insights for the first time. So, gentlemen, thanks very much.
Good to be here.
And let's kick off. Let's start with your high level kind of headline takeaway of what the current state of play is. I mean, I went through the litany of bombshell events that are really kind of head spinning in their velocity over the last 30 days or so. But John, maybe I can start with you and kind of give us your take on the current state of play, and then we'll start diving into the numbers.
Yeah, it feels like, at first, thanks for having me, both Kevin and Nate. It feels like we are all living a movie script in real time, right? I mean, like every day, it's like the Truman Show. It's just being written every day. And the fact is that we've never seen anything like this. For all of us, old timers who've been in this business a long time, we think we've seen it all, and then you have to wait 24 hours. And I think that what just happened with President Biden deciding not to run and Kamala Harris wrapping up the nomination is that it just blew everything up. It's one big reset. I mean, you can say, put it a lot of different ways. It was a defibrillator to the Democratic community, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, it's really a reset, right? You feel that this campaign or this election now is back to being incredibly competitive. I mean, I, like a lot of people, sat there and watched the Republican convention thinking, I haven't seen this type of energy and kind of consolidation since 2008 in Denver when I was out there with the Obama campaign. And then, just like that, you had J.D. Vance, who had a bad week, and you had Kamala Harris, who had a historic week. And you feel like this thing is just completely reset and that we're going to have 3 months of a real barn burner of a race.
Nate, I assume you would agree with that, but what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think reset is right. And I think where we are is back to where it felt like the race was at the beginning of the year. I mean, fundamentally, I think we walked into this election with an assumption that this was going to be a highly competitive race, that just based on how 2016 went, how 2020 went, we were going to come down to just a few battleground states, that it was going to be close. And Biden was behind, but keeping it close all the way up until that debate. And now where we are again is in a place, as John says, where we are competitive, where, neither side, I think, has a particular edge right now, which is far different than where we were before Biden stepped aside. And so we're back to Democrats have a level of enthusiasm, this kind of palpable sense of relief that they're back in the game. But at the same time, we have a long way to go. We've seen just the twists and turns already over the last month. There are going to be more to come on this one. So kind of keeping everything in perspective, that level of enthusiasm and excitement that's out there right now, we know it's not going to last forever. We know that Harris is going to take her hits. We know that Trump's going to take his. And now both candidates have a chance to start almost fresh at this point.
So
yeah, I think that after the Republican convention, the Democratic community writ large, I mean, I sat there and we were kind of like, oh, right? And I think that the Republicans are community at large right now are sitting there and kind of like, oh, meaning that, what they thought after their convention is not where they are sitting right now. And I think that they're a little flummoxed, quite frankly. And they're going to have to start from scratch to figure out what their new path is, just like the Democrats are sitting down and foreseeing their new path. And we're kind of back to hand combat, like Nate said. I mean, 2016, Trump wins by 75,000 votes in 3 states. In 2020, Biden wins by 47,000 votes in 3 states, 2 of which were different from 2016. And you just get a sense that it is going to be a really close election. And we now have 2 candidates, Trump and Harris, who have the ability and the acumen and the people and money around them to fight this out to a really close race.
So both of you have talked about reset, the sense of enthusiasm, and perhaps being a bit flummoxed on the opposing side. They're going to have to reset to adjust to all of this. I think we all kind of feel exactly what you both have just been talking about. So, John, maybe I can ask you about what the numbers are actually saying right now. On the one hand, it's kind of hard to believe that we're only about a week and change now into
Right.
the new dynamic. So. Yeah. As a pollster, are the numbers, are they telling you something yet, or is it still too premature for the real impact of what's happened to even have that in yet?
It's a great question, and it's yes and yes. The fact is that there has been an impact, and we have to wait for the full impact. And I think that, we've all been in enough races that, races involve multiple steps. And step 1 is consolidating your base. And Trump did that really early on, like got in consolidation at the 90% level. And the fact is that we were having trouble doing that until Kamala Harris got on the scene. And she has accomplished step 1 in a really fast, incredibly quick, to where she's moved African Americans, young people, Latinos, AAPI, which we often forget about, and women in some double digits, right, to where President Biden was. And so she's done a really good job of consolidating the base. And that's really important for 2 reasons. One is we had a youth problem, an African-American problem of voters staying home. And so that changes the actual math of the electorate. Plus, we were having bleed not only to Trump, but to third-party candidates. And so that consolidation is young people, African Americans, women are fired up. And so the math is good on what the electorate's going to look like. We're going to get young people out. We're going to get African Americans, AAPI, Hispanics out, women out. But also, I think we're going to see, and we've already seen in polls, that some of those people, especially young people who were going to vote for third-party candidates, are coming back to the fold, right? So step 1 is taken care of. Step 2 is always much more difficult for a Democrat or Republican in a presidential, and that is competing for persuadable voters. You can call them swing voters, independents, moderates, whatever it is. That is usually a post-convention, post-Labor Day activity. Like each side has over $1 billion to spend on paid communication and field. And so that small universe of persuadable voters is really too soon, right? That's going to be a I think a post-Labor Day endeavor for both camps. But also, like you said, we've been a week at this. I think, in a week or 2 weeks, when we start taking a look at these polls and individual polls, we're going to see, the wheat separated from the chaff. But we have seen her literally cut the lead in half, like by 2 points from where President Biden was. So that's real. And now we got to see what some of the individual state polls look like.
So I want to get back to that point about the persuadables here in just a moment. But Nate, let me ask you this. I mean, John just pointed out, the how fast this happened. And we know if you rewind the tape to ancient history, meaning a week or so ago, there were some in the Democratic Party who cautioned against the quote unquote coronation approach to Kamala Harris, that there ought to be a competitive process in some way, shape, or form. to be, before confirming the nomination, if you will. But given how fast everything has happened, both enthusiasm, money rolling in, endorsements, et cetera, are there things that concern or should concern the campaign? I don't want to say irrational exuberance here, but you pointed out already that Trump will recalibrate. They will get their points together. But are there elements of this that have happened so fast that there are concerns?
I think there are a couple things about this. I mean, one is the fact that Vice President Harris, for all of her talents, did not have to go through a primary this time around, right? She hasn't been tested in that electoral fashion in the same way that Joe Biden was in 2020, that Hillary Clinton was in 2016. And so she is starting this fresh. I mean, she's been a very accomplished vice president. She is very talented on the campaign trail. She knows her policy, but she doesn't have the same kind of campaign experience from being on the top of the ticket or having gone through that primary process, nor has that kind of vetting and examination of her record and her past public statements really been the thing that has been motivating Republicans up till now, right? As bottom of the ticket, she's obviously been a target, but not in the way that she's about to be, right? Not in the spotlight. The other is just the nature of how fast this has happened. She is right now vetting vice presidential candidates, and this will be the quickest vice presidential vetting process in very recent memory.
Yeah.
And the nature of how that process works, which is normally over a course of months, and this is happening over a course of weeks, means that they have to be extra buttoned up and extra sure. And even with all of that, there is going to be an extra level of attention on a new nominee who is being introduced to the general public and to the electorate for the first time in a very abrupt way. And as we are seeing on the Republican side right now, that doesn't always go very well. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting piece where both of these candidates are going to be under an immense amount of scrutiny in ways that they have not been before.
Yeah, and I would say that in some ways, to use a football analogy, Kamala Harris was like a backup quarterback, right? One, I don't think that, her presidential experience, meaning on the campaign, even though it didn't end well, those are still good experiences. Like she was in the frying pan. And the fact is that the last 3.5 years, she's been a really good partner. And as vice president, you're out there a lot. You're out there a lot speaking for the administration. And so those are really good experiences. And you got to just give her credit. Like, she has had a really good week. She looks like almost freed up. I mean, her, how she is messaging, how she is communicating to the American public has been really at a very high level. Now, to Nate's point, I mean, listen, she has 3 months to go. But I think that everyone probably on the other side underestimated her ability to do that. And I think she'll keep doing it. I think that right now she feels very comfortable in her skin about being the nominee. And there's not many people who I think could get there that quickly. And I think it's because of what her experience in the last 4 years, quite frankly, good and bad.
Look, John, I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of folks on the Democratic side who underestimated her up until about 35 days ago. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that what you are seeing now is folks kind of throwing off their hesitancy and just giving this full-throated embrace. Again, in part it is with that palpable sense of relief that we're back in the game, that the race is competitive again. But I think it also is a recognition that having been put in the spotlight in a way that is very different and unexpected, she met the moment. And certainly over the course of the last week and a half, but even before then. Look, she obviously has had that practice. She will be under that spotlight, but it doesn't happen in a vacuum either, right? The Democrats have been prepared. And one of the things about Harris being the nominee is that she inherits the infrastructure very, very smoothly for a campaign against Donald Trump. And that is probably one of the most underestimated benefits of having her on the ticket, is the fact that she's got this machine that is ready to go against Donald Trump and has been building it for months, if not years. And so they know what they need to do. Yes, they need to introduce her, but they also need to go after Donald Trump. And that's going to be part of what the next 3 months is going to be.
And a lot of times Kevin, I'll do lectures at colleges or, with campaign people. And my first slide is minimize mistakes. That's really sums up a campaign. And the fact is that if minimize mistakes is the goal in the next 3 months, there's probably more chance that Donald Trump being Donald Trump and Vance are gonna break that rule, right? That there's going to be more now about Trump Vance than there is about Harris. Can't again, every campaign is going to make mistakes. You can't help that. I mean, that's just part of the cycle. But the fact is that the negative narrative right now is about Trump's recent comments and about Vance, talking about digging up old interviews, calling, today was calling people who didn't have children sociopaths. And no, you can say, oh, it was taken out of context, whatever. Doubt it. The fact is all the negative narrative is right now on the Republican side, and all the positive narrative is on the Kamala side. And there's an excitement not only about her candidacy, but also about who the VP choice may be.
Yeah, so let me get back to that in a second. I want to talk to you, though, John, quickly about the road to 270, obviously 270 electoral votes. But before I do, you mentioned a few minutes ago, that sort of vanishingly small single-digit percentage of voters, the persuadables, right? In your polling and in the work that you've done, what is a persuadable? In this world of deep polarization that we hear about and talk about all the time, what is the profile of undecided voter today?
Yeah, I mean, like undecided, or you could also call them soft voters, right? I mean, here, this election cycle is much different than even 2020, because in 2020, you had almost no third-party voter, where in 16, you did. I mean, 6% was a lot, and it's really cost Hillary Clinton the election. In 2020, that evaporated. Well, now you're seeing double digits. That may not stay that way, right? So part of your persuadable voter is trying to bring some of those people who are parking their vote in a poll with third-party candidates back to one of the candidates. You have true undecideds. You have a small amount of soft voters on each side. And the fact is that they're disproportionately independents. They're self-identified independents under the age of 50. We have young people now who are just feeling left out of the process, like don't feel like their voice is being heard and relevant. And so young people are self-identifying at a really high level as independents or third-party candidates, et cetera. So that persuadable voter, swing voter, et cetera, tends to be younger and tends to be, again, really independent leaning. And it's a mistake to think that they're just all white. They're actually a pretty good universe of people of color, of Hispanics, African American, disproportionately African American men, younger, and AAPI.
So I know, acknowledging what you said earlier about we're early in this process, and so the numbers aren't telling a complete picture yet. But just in terms of what you're seeing so far, as well as your own experience, I mean, what do we see about the states that are in play? Are states that had been one color turning more purplish? Are purple states returning to their historic red or blue? I mean, how has this shaken things up, and how many states do you think are really still in play, or is it just as many?
So this goes back to the reset, right? This is where it's probably too soon. I mean, the tipping point state, I don't think changes, Pennsylvania and Michigan, right? I mean, I really do think that that's the tipping point. Pennsylvania is big, 19 electoral votes, right? So when you're doing the math, like you really need Pennsylvania if you're on both sides. So, and the same with Michigan. But I think that what we'll see in the coming month, if you will, is this going to be Nevada, Arizona, or is this going to be kind of Georgia, North Carolina as more than just the blue wall, right? I mean, the blue wall is real. I mean, that is how we get to 270 the quickest, if you will. But the fact is that you now have an African-American woman on the ticket. If you're in a place like Georgia and North Carolina, 31% African-Americans on election day make up Georgia, 21% in North Carolina. both places are chock full now of what? College-educated suburban voters, and women. And so that looks a lot different than Arizona and Nevada and even some of the blue states. And so, again, a little too early to be seen, but in a place like North Carolina, you have the most competitive, the biggest governor's race in America with Josh Stein, the Democratic Attorney General, against the Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson. There's an infrastructure there, right, for that governor's race, where in Georgia there isn't. So that's an interesting dynamic in itself. And so, again, I think right now all 7 are up and you're going to see paid communication in all 7. But I've been in enough presidentials that this is also about resource allocation. And at some point, some states are going to get favored over the others.
And
John,
Nate, what do you think about
Kevin, can I ask you a question of John, which is,
Yeah, sure.
John, were states like New Hampshire and Minnesota and Virginia really in play at the point before Biden, but between the debate and when Biden dropped out? And are those states out of play right now? Are those states realistic gets for Republicans at any point, and have they been at any point?
So I think that the honest answer is yes, they became in play. I mean, you saw some numbers in, for example, Virginia, where it was a +2 Biden, right? And I think that now they are not in play. I think Minnesota and Virginia. What was the other one you said, Nate?
New Hampshire was the other one.
New Hampshire. I think that, again, the base consolidation. I mean, part of the problem in Virginia, it wasn't Southern Virginia. It was that Northern Virginia it literally looks like our base, right? I mean, it is just young, African-American, Latino, Hispanic, APPI. I mean, AAPI. And so that was part of our problem, was a certain bleed and apathy. And so I think Virginia, Minnesota, and New Hampshire are much safer. And I think that if you're sitting there in the Trump headquarters today and you're talking with my good buddy, Tony Fabrizio, the pollster, they're probably saying, we need to get back to the basics. And forget about trying to expand into the folly of Minnesota.
So one of the resets of this is back to that set of battleground states.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
And Nate, what are you seeing now, or what are you thinking now in terms of down ballot? Obviously, one of the big pressures on President Biden to remove himself from the race was this concern of the down ballot impact, and that many analysts thinking that the House was going to flip to Democratic control, that was in jeopardy. Are we seeing an impact down ballot as well? And I note that just a week ago, even after all of this news broke, 6 Democrats did vote in the House with the House Republican caucus to pass a measure condemning Biden-Harris failure at the border. So what are you seeing on that front?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously, beyond even the grassroots enthusiasm, beyond even the party leadership, the real sense of relief that you felt last week was among down ballot Democrats who are in tough races against Republicans around the country. Now, what's interesting, and John will know more about this than I do, is if you looked at any of the polls that came out after the debate and before Biden stepped aside, he was underperforming Democrats in Senate races consistently in these competitive states, right? You would have Michigan Senate where the Democrats doing fairly well, Biden doing much worse. Wisconsin, same thing. Ohio, the same thing. Pennsylvania, the same thing. But what was certainly true was that the concern was very much there among candidates in competitive races at both the House and the Senate level, that Biden was going to be a drag on the entire party, and that they were going to begin to feel the effect even if they hadn't already. Now, it's not necessarily the case that all of their fears are assuaged at this point with the change at the top of the ticket. We've seen almost immediately after Harris became the nominee that the Republican in the Pennsylvania Senate race started running a really targeted ad against Bob Casey, the Democrat from Pennsylvania, functionally just using Kamala Harris's words against Casey. And I think there's a lot of thinking among Republicans that they're going to be able to do this in House and Senate races around the country, functionally targeting her as a San Francisco liberal and by extension making her the Nancy Pelosi of this year's cycle. Whether it ends up being a good strategy or not, obviously still TBD, but certainly Democrats are feeling a little more comfort now on the ballot than they were before Biden stepped aside.
Do you think, so John, both you and Nate have made this point that we've known Kamala Harris for quite some time, given the 2020 election cycle, and obviously now her 3.5+ years as vice president. But to some degree, she is a little bit undefined to the electorate, and I think to the point where some people were surprised, having kind of preconceived notions about her from 2020. When she came out swinging in her interview with Anderson Cooper in the minutes following the debate. That kind of full-throated defense of the president was actually one of her most impressive performances that a lot of people had seen in a while. And so, there's this opportunity to redefine her. At the same time, the Republican side, the Trump campaign, is going to be trying to define her as well from the counter-programming perspective. So there's not a lot of time to define her in a sense. And so this brings me to my question on the vice president decision, which it sounds like there is a plan to put her and her vice president candidate on the trail next week. So it sounds like this decision is pretty imminent. When you really think about, everything has been refracted through this lens of, well, Shapiro will deliver Pennsylvania, or Kelly would deliver Arizona, et cetera, et cetera. Historically, is that actually the case? Do these vice presidential candidates actually, quote unquote, deliver states, or other candidates like a Bashir or say a J.B. Pritzker, who don't necessarily, aren't either in a swing state or won't deliver the state, but have wider appeal, just as attractive as a potential candidate?
So I'll get that in a second. I do want to pick up something, Kevin, that you said about defining her. We found this, like Joe Biden, after being in the Senate for so long, being VP for 8 years. When he started in 2019, it's amazing how little people knew about him, right? That's just the way it is with vice presidential candidates. It's that way with everyone. And the fact is that what you've seen in some polls over the last week is her favorable has risen 6, 7, 8 points as people get to know her, as people learn that she was a badass prosecutor who put bad people in jail, or an attorney general who took on, the pharmaceutical companies, or whatever it is, like a U.S. senator, et cetera. So again, I think we have to remind people that something like $2.5 billion are going to be spent between the two sides in the next 3 months. Oh, by the way, in 7 states, right? And so people are going to learn, they're not going to learn anything new about Donald Trump, but they're going to learn a lot about Kamala Harris, especially on the positive side. We're up, the campaign's up with a $50 million ad right now called Fearless, which is a 1-minute ad, which I encourage everyone to watch, which goes through that she was a prosecutor, attorney general, senator, vice president, and does the contrast. And so, that is a benefit to us because people can learn new positive things about Harris. And will they hear negative things? Sure, by the Trump campaign. But there's also a real danger in the Trump campaign and the Vance and JD Vance. And you've seen this with JD Vance already, hitting her, the childless cat lady and all that type of stuff. It is really dangerous. They're going to have to, they're having more trouble figuring out how to contrast with Kamala Harris than the Kamala Harris campaign is figuring out how to contrast on Trump and Vance. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's all going to happen. Listen, I've been through enough presidential campaigns that your first thing with a VP is do no harm. And Trump is experiencing that right now. This has not been a good week or 2 weeks for JD Vance. And there's a lot more to come because he's given so many interviews. And so you don't want to do any harm. But, all the rules seem to have been thrown out the window in the last, 7 or 8 years. And I do think that a VP candidate potentially, kind of like Johnson with Kennedy, right, when he helped bring Texas over, could help in some of these states. We have really popular governors in the blue wall, and we have popular people like Senator Kelly in Arizona. And so I think that there is some ability to help kind of juice the presidential candidate in certain states where the possible VP candidate is from.
So Nate, notwithstanding the fact that the next big events are going to be the announcement of that vice president and the virtual roll call securing the nomination for that ticket, but then the big thing after that in a couple of weeks' time will be the Democratic National Convention. It sounds like they're probably going to have a very different convention than they would have had had the original ticket been in place. What are you expecting the utility of this convention will now be, or best used as?
Look, I mean, I think the utility of any convention begins with it is a 4-day advertisement for the party and most specifically the ticket. And in this case, it really will be the introduction of Kamala Harris and her running mate to the broader world, right? It's a lot of theater at this point. It's very certain that it's not going to be a lot of mystery. There's no smoke-filled room that's emerging with a candidate on this one. This is literally just an opportunity for Harris, for her running mate, for the broader Democratic Party to put their best foot forward. And that is both going to be a combination of let's tell the Harris story, let's tell the story of the ticket, let's tell the story of the party's agenda moving forward, but very much a contrast with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and the broader Republican Party, right? There is going to be a lot of time spent on reminding folks of the first Trump presidency, reminding them of Trump over the last few years, reminding them of Vance's record, and a contrast between the tickets. And I think that's what you're going to take away from this more than anything else.
Can I ask you guys this too? Because since both of you have been involved in campaigns and it certainly feels like there's been this enormous shot of adrenaline. You've both described this to a certain degree already, and you see these kind of analyses that essentially the Democratic Party has seen nothing like this since Obama, right? That like Biden 2020, Clinton 2016 didn't measure up to this level of enthusiasm. And I'm wondering if you think that's actually true, or has the enthusiasm gotten to just where it really needs to be if you're going to have a winning shot, period, at this point in 3.5 months, 4 months out from the election? Are people making too much of the level of enthusiasm, or do you see this as something as historically different?
You can never make too much of enthusiasm. Like we've seen the enthusiasm gap where Trump voters, versus now Harris voters. We've seen that number jump 20 points. Like it's now in the mid to high 80s for both. And what is the byproduct of that? One is when you have an excited and energized base, some of those people are coming back from third-party candidates. Some of them are coming back from the bench where they were going to sit the election out. That becomes really important. She's raised $200 million in like 10 days. She's getting Zoom calls with 20 and 30 and 40,000 people on them. So it's real. Like enthusiasm is real. We're at a time when, you mostly have paid communication on TV and digital, right? But you also have to have an infrastructure. There has to be young people knocking on doors and things like that. And it's created literally a infrastructure. They can't deal with the volunteers that are signing up now, right? And so to be able to have an absolute army, which is part of Democratic kind of history, right? Having this Democratic army out there in these states, knocking at doors, going to events, et cetera, et cetera. It's a little less so in the Republican Party. That has not been its history. It's not how it's won races. So it's real. I don't think that it goes down. It could actually even go up a little bit. And I think that the Democratic Convention is a place where you channel all of that, right? And you get your 4 days. And they're kind of free days in some ways. And then what happens? The next week is Labor Day and the bell rings. And the bell literally rings and you start this race. And you have a 2-month, race to the finish.
Okay, so I want to get to that 2-month sprint here in a second, but two kind of last questions for each of you before we move on. One is, Nate, what do all of these endorsements mean? Are they actually meaningful? Not, I mean, obviously Biden's endorsement was key because the money comes, the campaign infrastructure comes, and so on and so forth. But I'm talking about all the rest of it, the celebrities, the singers, the athletes, the business people, Wall Street, Hollywood, Silicon Valley. Do they matter? So
I
those
mean, look, they do.
that John was describing
To John's point, they matter for enthusiasm. They matter for generating that level of grassroots support for those volunteers, for those people who are going to be knocking on doors or making the phone calls. They matter for raising money, right? They matter for both small dollar donations and big dollar donations. They matter for credibility. They matter for reaching audiences that you might not otherwise reach. And I want to quibble with something that you said earlier, Kevin. I don't think 2020 lacked for enthusiasm. Now, it was the middle of a pandemic, so there was a different way of manifesting itself. But the one commonality between 2024 and 2020, there were a lot of Democrats who were motivated to defeat Donald Trump, right? And what they've been given in the last couple of weeks is a reason to believe they can defeat him again. But that enthusiasm in 2020 absolutely was palpable, and you did see celebrities come out, right? You had The Rock endorsing, you had Taylor Swift coming out, you had various celebrities raising money on Zoom calls and all sorts of other ways. And you're seeing some of that picking up again over the last couple of weeks, and it matters just for keeping that level of momentum going. Look, how many voters it converts at the end of the day, how many doors get knocked on at the end of the day just because Jennifer Aniston came out against JD Vance, probably difficult to measure. But is it getting a lot of attention? Is it bringing more attention to the cat lady comments that Jennifer Aniston came out? 100%. So there is some credibility to the idea that when you've got folks who are known, especially known in really general audience ways, that does help a ticket.
John, what do you hear from your friends on the other side of the aisle who poll for the Republicans? Or if you were to put yourself in their shoes for a second, what are you looking for right now? What does the data show where her weak points that they ought to be kind of focusing in on at this juncture in an environment where at this point she hasn't made and her campaign haven't made any mistakes yet. So what do you think that I'm sure they're testing their areas of attack.
Yeah, I'm not going to give a blueprint on how to attack her, but the fact is that they're going to do all that research. Here's where I think they probably make their mistakes. It's not in the narrative of attacking her, but in the tone and how they do it. And I mean, you can just look at Democratic ads and Republican ads are always a little bit more, vitriolic, caustic, whatever you want to, over the top. I mean, it really is that way. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years. And sometimes we're like, hey, if they would have just done a different iteration of how of their tone. And I think that, I think the fact is that they are, again, a little bit, they don't know how to deal with this. Like, how do you, it was easy to, in some ways, to attack a Hillary Clinton because she was an entity that was known, right? And people had certain feelings about her. And I think it's just going to be really much more difficult in how they're going to frame an attack or contrast on Kamala Harris. And I think most of the times they're going to get the tone wrong, and it actually may backfire.
So I want to digress for just 1 second here, and hopefully you'll indulge me, John. I was going to ask you, since I've got you here, is to talk to the audience just a little bit about the state of polling today. We've heard all of this talk about the increasing challenges of polling because young people won't pick up the phone and, et cetera, et cetera. So from a technique perspective and in terms of, how you analyze the data, can you talk, kind of update us on the state of the industry a little bit, and also just, some of the other kind of key findings that you're uncovering right now in all of this. We've talked about the gender imbalance that's emerged here, but any other interesting deviations from norm or historical norm that you're really picking up on?
Well, first is polling has become harder. It's become harder not only because of how we communicate and how we, talk to each other or communicate to each other, right? Without a doubt. But it's also just become harder because of this guy, Trump, right? I mean, like, he's kind of messed with the system a little bit. And there's certain universes that are just really harder to reach, right? Certain conservatives and off the grid, if you will, and younger people, et cetera. And so polling, if you're going to do it right, is really expensive. And, we've all been around. I mean, think about, I don't know, in 2000, when you had Bush Gore, you probably had 4 or 5 major media outlets doing polling. And now every day there's a poll out. And I would say a quarter of the time, I've never heard of the polling operation, or there's a university or college attached to it that probably shouldn't be doing polling. So unfortunately, there's a lot of bad polling out there, and polling is really expensive. I helped co-found with Tony Fabrizio the Wall Street Journal poll. We've both had to step back because we're involved in the presidential. But the fact is that they were really committed to spending a lot of money to do it the right way, multimodal. You get interviews in many different ways, maybe a little bit of landline, maybe some cell phone line interviews, then, online, text to web, or et cetera. So you can reach all these hard to reach universes. And most media outlets just don't spend that type of money to get that. We learned a lot from 2016 about not getting enough, non-college educated voters and the type of non-college educated. So we've corrected for a lot of things. But the fact is that what we do as polling professionals for a political campaign or a corporation is much different, quite frankly, than what you see for most of the media outlets. And that's really unfortunate at this point in time. So, I mean, it's not an easy industry in terms of conducting that, but if you do it the right way, it's still very, very helpful and useful, not only to the prognostication of who's going to win or lose, but the message development, which we provide our clients, which is really what we do.
Nate, how do you see Kamala Harris's position in the sort of the corporate world, in a sense? I mean, I think we've seen where she's already, in a sense, differentiated herself a little bit from the president on things like AI and crypto, but in even in a broader sense, where she's got clear backers and friends in the tech industry, in the financial industry here in New York, in Silicon Valley broadly, in Hollywood, et cetera. Is she easily defined in terms of her business friendliness, or how do you see it?
I think not yet is probably the answer, Kevin, which is not a slight on her. It's just that this has all been very new. And if you think about it, this is a public servant who's had functionally 3 phases of public service in her life. One is as a lawyer and a prosecutor and an attorney general in California. The second is as the senator from California, turned fairly immediately into a presidential candidate for the 2020 primaries. And the third is as vice president of the United States. And she's vice president of the United States for an administration that has done some things that business really loves and has done some things that business really wishes they would do differently. As a prosecutor and as an attorney general, she has a fairly moderate record, especially by California standards. But in between that, she took some fairly progressive positions, some of which she's now winding back, but in ways that would give folks some pause, right? And so if you look at what she had to say or what her campaign said about her position on fracking, what she's going to be called into account for on Medicare for All, on Green New Deal, on a whole host of things that were very much Democratic primary issues back in 2019, 2020, there are questions out there. And there are questions about the Biden administration's approach to some issues that are really important to business leaders that she's going to be asked about, whether it is on antitrust or it is on taxes or it is on regulations. There are issues that business leaders have with this administration and are going to want some clarity from her on. And she just hasn't had a chance to really address some of these issues in a really robust way. It doesn't mean she's in a bad place. It doesn't mean she's in a good place. It's only 9 days into this. This is just going to be some of the questions that she'll have to answer that CEOs and the corporate community are going to expect to have some clarity on.
Can I just add 2 things to that? One is, when you look at, the corporate community, one way to, again, gauge how real Kamala Harris is, and I'm sure you deal with this with your clients all the time, everyone's hedging now, right? Everyone's out there now in corporate America wanting to know how they can, donate and be, to the Kamala Harris campaign or to the DNC convention, et cetera, et cetera. They see how real this is. And you know why I think that they also see it? From their employees, right? I mean, all of a sudden, there's just a new feeling about this race with their employees, especially high-tech companies who have young people, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing is, and you'll have to fact check me on this, but we're in an environment also that even though there was a lot of corporate America and banking industry, et cetera, that liked kind of the open door policy of the Trump administration, I don't think that there is any CEO, top 100 American CEO, who has endorsed Trump. There's also a real hesitancy about what he would mean to America and American policy in 4 years. And that benefits Vice President Kamala Harris as well, is that it's not just about, how they think about her or wonder how they're going to be about on policy, but there's a queasiness in corporate America about Donald Trump as well.
Yeah, sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
I mean, I wanted to kind of land the plane by asking both of you, because, certainly, Nate, you head up this effort for Teneo, but I know, John, you also engage with corporate entities too. So at this point, what are you being asked by them, considering this earthquake that has just occurred? What are they wondering about? And I guess, John, you made this point that we're going to get to the convention. And then after we get through the convention, it's the 2-month sprint, right? We are on this sprint. Yeah. And at some point, the policy prescriptions are going to have to start coming out. We haven't had the benefit of this long period. So, Harris's proxies haven't put her foreign policy platform into foreign affairs yet, as an example, and so on and so forth. So when are we going to start to actually see this? Yeah. When are we going to see who the key advisors are on the key domestic policy platforms, foreign policy platforms, economic platforms? And so how are you advising, as I know is a kind of multi-part, how are you advising corporations to address this at this juncture in the cycle?
So there's always two questions I get from my corporate clients. And one is really simplistic and pragmatic. Can she win? I mean, that's really it, right? And the answer is yes. Yes. This is really a toss-up election now. And maybe I think it's fair to say, is Donald Trump still the front runner? Yeah, sure. Will he be on, the Tuesday after Labor Day? I just think it's going to be a toss-up race, right? So one is, can she win? And the answer is, I think we all feel today that she can absolutely win. And the second question is like all of a sudden, corporate America is scrambling to try to know who is close to Kamala Harris. What would a cabinet look like? Who are her close advisors? Like, people don't know that Lorraine Voles is her chief of staff, right? Things like that. Or Sheila Nix is her traveling chief of staff. Or Brian Fallon is her communications director. And so all of a sudden, I remember a lot of times you'd get hired at the beginning of 2023 because, 2021, because corporate America just didn't know the architecture of the Biden world. And right now, corporate America is trying to figure out the architecture of the Kamala Harris world. And why? Because they think that she probably could win.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the other piece on this, John and Kevin, is, look, on both sides of this, there is a hunger to understand the direction and the implications for either of these candidates winning, right? And I think, we have seen this and we've had more time to collectively educate ourselves on what a second Trump administration could look like. I think, what we have been thrust into is this much more abrupt place of, how much is a Harris 1.0 like a Biden 1.0? Or is it going to be radically different in some ways and very similar in other ways? And it's all very much a result of a functional battlefield promotion where a lot of this just hasn't been determined yet, right? You can look at her prior positions, you could look at her leadership roles and her priorities and her responsibilities and her passions in every walk of her public service, and you can glean some things from these. But what does that mean for how she's going to implement the IRA or how she's going to approach a tax debate or what her approach to China is going to be, there are a lot of blanks that her campaign is going to be filling in over time as well on this. And there is some stuff that's just going to be a function of there are 3 months left to go before Election Day, and not all of these things are going to become priorities for her campaign to answer, just given that their only mission right now is win this election in November, right? And so there are still going to be some blank spaces here. Are we likely to have a really full visible view of what her cabinet looks like? No, but realistically, you wouldn't do that with any candidate at this point either. What you can do, to John's point, is you can get a good sense as to what her priorities are. You can get a good sense as to where her advisors are. You can start to fill in some of those blanks as it builds in over time. And you can extrapolate a lot. I mean, the fact that she is the vice president to a sitting administration with a continuity that is assumed in certain ways, I think is part of what the direction of a first Harris administration would be. And obviously, we are spending a lot of time with our clients right now thinking through what a Trump administration would be. And it really is a study in contrast, right? You've got two very different visions across a whole host of issues, where the kind of the substance of where they fall on foreign policy, domestic policy, national security issues, and a whole host of other ones is really apparent, even if you don't have all the details around Harris priorities.
And is it fair to say, I mean, there's only so many hours in a day, and so priorities are going to have to be made at some juncture that the president elect and then president will then face, and not all of those are determined inside the White House, right? You're one invasion away from your entire priority list being upended. But if you go back to 2020, much was made of how when Trump entered in the White House, they weren't as prepared. They didn't know that they were going to win necessarily. It took a long time to get particularly the Senate-approved positions in place. And so even the areas where they had policy ideas, the ability to execute took time. Is it fair to say, even with this truncated campaign period that the vice president has got, that because she's a part of the current administration and she's inheriting that machine, that even if all of the policy priorities have not yet been articulated, they will be ready to go on day one should she prevail on November 5th?
I just think that the bench is deeper of people with experience. I mean, you've had, again, an infrastructure in every agency, department, et cetera, White House there for 3.5 years. You had a 4-year break during Trump, but then you had 8 years of the Obama administration. So I just think our bench of people who can be high quality, professionals in an administration is just kind of bigger and deeper, quite frankly. And I think that on the Trump side of it, there is this, and I don't mean to be a smartass about this, but there's just a hope from my Republican friends that if he wins, they can just keep the crazies out and have people who are, can really just do the job. That's a much different lift than what we have.
And look, the reality is that even if Biden were the candidate right now, and even if he were to get elected in November, you are still going to see some level of shuffling, some level of turnover. I mean, it is remarkable the longevity and the tenure of some of the cabinet officers around Biden right now. Some of these folks really have stuck it out through 4 very, very difficult years at this point, or will be 4 by the end of the administration. And some of these folks were just naturally going to be leaving. And so one way or another, you were going to be seeing turnover for the next administration. And it is true that in some cases, that means deputies are going to get elevated. In some cases, it's going to be whole new leaders. It is going to be a new set of advisors around her, but there are going to be a lot of folks who probably are going to be willing to stick around and at least help through the transition. It's not going to be abrupt. It is going to be smoother.
We have 98 days to go until the November 5th election. If there's one thing we have learned, it is to straight line nothing. More to come. We at Teneo will continue to follow this rapidly unfolding story. We will be continuing to follow it on Teneo Insights. The Republican side will be represented on here as well over the next couple of months, so please join us. In the meantime, if any questions arise or you'd like to follow up, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Teneo Insights at teneo.com. Meanwhile, I would like to thank John Anzalone and Nate Tamarin for joining today and for your thoughts. Clearly a lot to take in. So appreciate it, both of you gentlemen. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.